All right, I was not satisfied with the previous video and the tools of social psychology that I left you with. So I want to add a few more. I think this is not necessarily an intro to social psych video, but is more of an intro to more ways you can think about the issues that we're covering in this class. And the first, just as hopefully a review for you at this point, is that you should always be looking at research studies or looking at issues that we discuss in this class in terms of your ABCs. That is affect, behavior, and cognition. Understanding that in everyday life, when people talk about these three things, they mix them all together. But in a psychology course, especially a social psychology course, you have to understand these are three separate things that have to be analyzed separately. In your ABCs, we're going to start with social cognition here. Cognition is any information processing strategy. Social cognition is any information processing strategy related to social activities. So it's when your brain is using shortcuts to understand the behavior of others, predict the behavior of others. This is same thing you do with physical phenomenon, but living entities are much more unpredictable than physical phenomenon. You pick something up and drop it, falls to the ground. Pick something up and drop it, falls to the ground. Do it over and over again, you get the same result every time. So you start to understand that something like gravity is at work here. But you can do the same thing to 15 different people and they'll all have 15 different reactions. So predicting social behavior more complex than predicting physical behavior in most situations. This is why we rely on shortcuts. Some of the shortcuts that you need for this class are schemas. A schema is a knowledge representation that includes some info about a person or group. So a schema is some pre-existing information that you use to analyze a certain situation. You walk into a classroom and you see somebody walk in wearing a shirt and tie and standing up at the podium at the front of the room. That fits into your schema about what is likely to happen in a classroom, and you're going to assume what about that person, right? If your brain immediately said that's the professor or that's the teacher, that's a well-working schema. If your brain said that is another student in the class or that is your local TV weatherman, I don't think your schema is working properly because those predictions about who that is are likely to fail, likely to not be true. Another thing that you might use for your social cognition would be attitudes. An attitude is a knowledge representation that includes your kind of general like or dislike of a person, a thing, or a group. So your attitudes typically inform you of how to react to the world. They're usually pretty simple and they usually help guide your behavior pretty well. They can go wrong. I think that I have an attitude toward students. Whenever I walk into a classroom, I see people sitting in seats. I typically I have a positive attitude towards students because that has both helped me predict behavior, because typically students are likable people, and it also helps me simplify my actions. If I walk into a classroom and assume the people sitting in the seats are hostile towards me, that is going to make my life worse. That's not a good way to behave. Attitudes can be good, can be bad. They're simplifications. It's important to recognize in both of these examples, with schemas, with attitudes, with other forms of social cognition, this is all your brain taking shortcuts because it has to. Your brain is lazy because it needs to be. If you analyzed every social situation as if it was brand new, your brain would short circuit, it would fry itself working too hard. Imagine for a minute that you are walking around a small town, someone comes at you and you hear them, they're speaking English, they're asking you a question, they are wearing the same clothes as you, they're speaking the same language as you, you automatically make a bunch of assumptions about that person. But if you make no assumptions, you don't know whether that person is human or an alien impersonating a human. They're speaking English, but is it because they memorized a sentence in English, or do they actually speak the language? Did they steal those clothes? I hope you see how ridiculous I'm being with those examples, right? What I'm trying to display is that you make a lot of assumptions about people that you don't even have to think about because they're so automatic. If you stop and realize that if you didn't make those assumptions about the people you see in your social environment, it would make your life much harder. You've got the lesson. In our ABCs of social psychology, we're recognizing that in any situation, your affect, behavior, and cognition should be treated as three separate things happening in any social situation. We're moving on to affect, which is the feelings we experience as part of just living. Affect is feelings. Now, in the social psychology class, we need to be clear about what is mood, affect, emotion. So affect is feelings. Emotions are brief but often intense mental and physiological feeling states. And a mood refers to the positive or negative feelings that are kind of in the background of everyday experiences. So I think of mood as a long-term thing. It's something that is in the background. It doesn't change second by second usually. It's just a positive or negative feeling. But an emotion is, from a social psych analysis, an emotion is a program that your brain is running to help organize your emotion, organize your response at any given moment. So the emotion of anger, when you feel anger, that is a brief but intense mental and physical state that organizes your thoughts and your actions into being ready to fight or flight. Okay, that's anger. Sadness is a brief but intense mental and physiological state that prepares you to do certain things. So, an emotion, more of a short-term thing, an organizing principle, whereas affect just refers to feelings, and mood refers to kind of that general positive or negative feeling you have. How can we use this? You should be using this when you think about that behavior is a result of an interaction between person variables and environment variables. Where does mood come in? Where does an emotion come in? We're going to consider that a person variable in this example here. When you're analyzing the result of someone's affect, behavior, and cognition, the result is the behavior, and you should be thinking about how your mood, how your emotions are interacting with the situation you're in to lead to certain behaviors. So if we change the emotion, we change the resulting behavior. That's what we should take away from this. All right. Last of the eight, I include behavior last because, well, psychologists don't use the word behavior in a radically different way than what everyday people use the word behavior. Behavior, it's the stuff you do. Do I need to explain more? Probably not. Let's move on to another tool of social psychology that I want you to include in your toolkit. And this is analyzing a situation using different levels of analysis. So what do I mean by levels of analysis? I think of it this way. Often you can answer several different true answers to the same question. Why am I hungry right now? Well, I could explain the chemical processes that are happening in my digestive system that are leading to changes in hormones in my body that are leading me to feelings of hunger. If I explain those processes to you, that would be a true answer. But if you ask, why am I hungry right now? And I say it's because I don't have any food in the kitchen and I didn't eat breakfast this morning. That's a different answer, totally different, but it's also true, right? I'm looking at the problem from two different levels of analysis. In psychology, we should always be aware that there are different true answers to every problem. And it depends on what level, what set of analysis that we're talking about. You can explain someone's behavior at the individual level, what's going on with them as an individual right now. What's their personality like? What's their learning history like? The interpersonal level is asking to explain someone's behavior in a social setting. Interpersonal is interacting with other people. Societal is asking to explain someone's behavior in a social setting, in the society that they're living in this particular moment. I kind of view those three as a set, and the next three as another set, because you can also explain someone's behavior physiologically. That is, what is going on in their brain and body at the moment that helps explain how they're behaving. Functionally, which also I think is sometimes synonymous with the evolutionary perspective. A functional explanation of the behavior is, why is their body designed that way? Why are they engaging in that behavior? And an evolutionary explanation of their behavior is, well, why would this organism be designed that way over long periods of time through evolution by natural selection? Let's look again at my question of, why am I hungry right now? An individual level of analysis would be, I'm hungry because I didn't eat this morning. Interpersonal would be, I'm hungry because, well, I didn't interact with anybody else today, so we didn't go get food, which is a social event in many cultures. Societally, I am hungry because I am living in a society where it's normal to eat breakfast in the morning, so my body expects me to have breakfast in the morning, and I skipped it. So there is a societal level explanation for why I'm hungry. Physiologically, I'm hungry because of a cascade of hormonal changes that led me to the experience of hunger. Functionally, I am hungry because the human body is designed to request food if it hasn't had food in a certain amount of time. And from the evolutionary perspective, my ancestors that sought food when they were hungry were more likely to survive and reproduce than my ancestors who were not motivated to seek out food when they were hungry. They starved to death. Not usually, that's not how evolution works, but I'm oversimplifying this example. What should you do with this tool of psychology, these levels of analysis? You should always be asking yourself, when we're covering a topic in this class, are there different correct answers explaining why this behavior is going on? Can I divide my response up into different levels of an answer? This is a research tool that I have only recently started adding in to my own thinking about the research process and thinking about issues in social psychology, because the basic version that I was taught is that there's applied research and basic research. You probably heard about this, maybe even heard it from me, where basic research is about the underlying like psychological processes behind something, and applied research is applying that basic knowledge to the real world. But I've recently learned a better way to do this that actually really improved the way I analyzed problems. And that is thinking about problem-oriented research studies versus process-oriented research studies. So this is looking, when you perform research in psychology, there's these two broad goals, and some basic research is process-oriented, some applied research is problem-oriented, but those categories don't always fit super well. Anyway, problem-oriented research studies a phenomenon. That means something that you see occurring. I see prejudice occurring in my community. I ask the question, how can we reduce prejudice? I do some research on that. I understand that hand washing is really important to prevent the spread of disease. So I ask, how can we increase hand washing? So this is focused on the phenomenon that's occurring and how psychological variables can change it, good or bad. The second approach is process oriented. That is, what psychological processes or what social processes influence the thing I'm researching. So instead of asking, how can we reduce prejudice, I might ask, what cognitions underlie prejudice? Instead of asking, how can we increase hand washing, I ask the question, do social norms influence hand washing? So I'm not studying, it's a very subtle distinction. I'm in the second example on the right of the slide, I'm not actually studying hand washing. I'm studying social norms. That's when the light bulb went off in my head, what the real important difference here is. How can we reduce prejudice? I'm studying the behavior, what cognitions, how can we reduce prejudice? Prejudice isn't a behavior, but at least it behaviors. You get what I'm saying. Just be careful in a social psych lecture. But in the second, studying the process, what cognitions underlie prejudice, I'm doing research on cognitions and how they change. So what I want you to take away from this is that a lot of research does one of these things or the other. Some of it does both, but these are really two different things. And let me give you a more concrete example of a recent study that I read. Because of some court cases, things going on in the legal world that I'm less familiar with, but know about because of their influence on psychology, an outstanding question is, do diverse juries make better informed decisions than non-diverse juries? Now, what does diversity mean in that case? It could mean racial diversity, ethnic diversity, or diversity of other life experiences, such as high wealth, low wealth individuals. You know, you can split the word diversity into many different meanings, but this question still stands for all of them. And so researchers can perform mock jury studies, which is nowadays a popular way of performing research, where you put people in a situation where you have them pretending that they're actually on a jury, and sometimes you give them real court cases, sometimes you give them vignettes that you made up, but you're studying the phenomenon of the jury's decision, okay? Now, this goes hand in hand, and in fact, you'll see the citations that I used are on the slide here. The older citation was in the references section of the newer citation. That's how well these two fit together. You can study the phenomenon, the problem of the jury's decision, or you can study the process. What are the psychological processes that lead to decision making? And that's what you see in the second citation here. They ask, does dissent in a mock jury influence cognition, attitudes, or behaviors? So what that researcher found is that dissenting opinions have a very pronounced impact on how a jury behaves. But they weren't studying the jury decisions necessarily. They were studying how cognition is influenced by something. But then that research ties hand in hand with later researchers, their issue of the actual jury decision making. And in fact, what the researchers from Bergold and colleagues, they found that diverse juries did make more informed decisions than non-diverse juries. they had a couple different definitions of what diversity is, so that there wasn't just one study here. But they found that when you had a diverse jury for the mock jury that they were setting up, they included more information, they remembered more, they stated more information, they were better informed. But these go hand in hand. You have to go back and forth, and you could say, this is how the jury made its decision. What were the psychological principles behind that? So the tool of social psych, I want you to take away from this, is that we can approach the same issue from a problem-oriented approach or a process-oriented approach, because that really helped me.